was in 2008 or 2013. We met 20 some years ago. So you're retired also.
As I alluded to in my first brief statement this morning, there is a huge number of areas where cooperation has taken place and where developments truly have been impressive in Estonia over the past 30 years. And I mentioned the fact that we are not touching on the whole issue of macroeconomic reform, even though we heard a few words from Mart Laar, which I think was very, very relevant and useful. However, we had to decide on how to deal with the very complex web of fields of cooperation. And I had this vision to discuss something that really did not take place within the government circles, where governments really, well, we'll hear more about that, I suppose. But my impression is that parts of this cooperation did not at all take place within the context of government-to-government relations, but really in direct contacts between the civil societies of our two countries. And I think one very good example of that is how student unions worked together on a voluntary basis, on a day-to-day basis, on a very personal basis. And I think, and then we chose that as an example, as a case study of how this type of cooperation was carried out. And for that I have asked three eminent panelists to discuss this among themselves, and possibly, if there are questions, of course, also with you and the audience. Our first speaker will be Niklas Granholm, who is now an active member of the staff at the Defense Research Institute Agency in Sweden, and in Sweden a well-known commentator on defense and security issues. But that's not why you're here, really. You're here because at the time you were very active in student politics. The same goes for Anna Westerholm, who is currently the Swedish ambassador for the Eastern Partnership. But at the time, you as well was very active in student politics and had very close contacts with Estonian counterparts, among which was Kaarel Tarand, who will then follow up with comments from an Estonian perspective on how this cooperation went on. Kaarel is today the editor-in-chief of the newspaper Sirp, the cultural paper Sirp, and you have also been active, I think, with the National Museum and Ministry of Education before. But again, going back to the time period we are discussing, you were also active in student politics. So with those words of introduction, we'll start over there with Niklas, and then Anna and Kaarel. So, please.
Thank you, Michael, for this very, very kind introduction. And this will be a very mostly imperfect presentation, and it covers my own recollections and perspectives here from almost 30 years ago. And I must say I'm very grateful to be able to come back to Tallinn and for the opportunity to speak here about this today and reflect somewhat on what we did here and then. But what we did here in Estonia, there was only a tiny component of a very much larger process here. So what Anna, Kaarel, and I, and many others did here, that was just a part of a complex and very wide-ranging effort that helped to re-establish the independence and sovereignty of Estonia. And it involved many others. But the most important part was done by you all here. Estonia, along with the other Baltic nations, regained their independence by the efforts of its own mainly by the efforts of its own nationals. So this is a presentation in two parts. the work together with our Estonian friends as a student union official, and secondly, what followed for my part on afterwards. So when does a story like this really begin? Growing up in Sweden during the 1970s and 80s, we know the history and what had happened here. The Cold War divided the Baltic Sea for me and many others. The threat from the Soviet Union was acutely felt. The new Cold War, the nuclear Euro missile debate, submarine incursions into Swedish waters, and not least school friends whose parents and grandparents had fled across the Baltic Sea during World War II, contributed to this picture. In the spring of 1990, I was a student at the Department of Political Science at Stockholm University. Most of the faculty, the PhD candidates, and some of our students undertook a study trip to Estonia via Finland in early May. Tallinn in the spring of 1990 seemed to be a capital suspended between two different systems, where the existing power was withering away fast. The portrait of Lenin greeted us in the port when we debarked the year Ots from Helsinki. The Rigi-Kogu with the black, white and blue flag raised on the rooftop. The Soviet emblem that disappeared from the front of the palace during our stay. On one side of the market square with postcards from with Estonian motifs on sale, and on the other patriotic Soviet postcards, badges and emblems. The city was full of Soviet soldiers who had the day off and crowded the streets and a few open liquor stores. Meetings were arranged for our group where members of the Estonian Soviet optimistically assured us that independence was on its way. During the meeting, the windows rattled with the gun salute for the victory in the Second World War. It was the 9th of May. Our visit continued with a trip to the University of Tartu. The university, with its long traditions and historical links to Sweden, being the second university formed in 1630, was something we could often start our conversations with. Tartu had clearly fallen on hard times, and its infrastructure was very run down. It had largely been cut off from international academic and student exchange for decades. We returned to Stockholm full of impressions that were difficult to sort out. Later in the spring of 1990, events led me to be elected as an ombudsman at the Student Union of Stockholm University. My post on the Student Union board was to chair the International Affairs Committee. Together with my co-workers, we ran the international issues and arranged debates and discussions. 1990 and 91 were very busy years indeed. The Berlin Wall had fallen along with the Iron Curtain, Germany was reunited, the First Gulf War erupted, and across the Baltic Sea the Soviet Union was crumbling, and re-establishment of independence for the three Baltic states happened. The rumblings of what later exploded into the Balkan Wars could be heard. With the wonderful benefit of hindsight, all that then happened in Europe at breakneck pace today seems almost like a done deal. For us at the time it was no such thing. The risk of open hostilities always looked like a distinct possibility, and in some cases also became a reality. In Vilnius in mid-January, 14 civilians were killed by Soviet troops in the attempt to defend the television tower. On the 17th of January, the Operation Desert Shield turned into Desert Storm, and Iraqi forces were driven out of Kuwait. This led to widespread concern that the Soviet Union would use the international focus on the Gulf War to undertake further operations in an attempt at holding the empire together. Later that month, a message from Tartu Student Union reached us in Stockholm. In it, grave concerns were expressed that the Soviet authorities would attempt something similar that would lead to bloodletting also in Tartu. It was a plea for assistance. How could we help? We discussed this immediately. There was never any doubt that we would do something, but what? If there was an outbreak of violence against students in Estonia, there was little we could do but to protest verbally. We would have done that, of course, but we also chose to take a long-term perspective. This led us to start a support program designed to assist in building up the Student Union and establish it as a legitimate and democratic body in support of the students to act as an interest group for all students. We invited one of the officials from Tartu over to Stockholm, and during a couple of days of intensive meetings, a program was developed. This ranged from the material to the practical. There was an acute shortage of nearly everything, from printing paper, pens, typewriters and ribbons. The practical focused on techniques for holding meetings and how to increase legitimacy by electing a student union body. We also started to include the Tartu Student Union into the regular conference and meetings held by the student bodies around the Baltic Sea. The long-standing Swedish practice, today abandoned, that membership in a student union was obligatory, also opened up possibilities. On the Bildt the students paid each term, there were several alternatives for voluntary contributions. Our policy was that these alternatives were focused on support for other student bodies and humanitarian aid. This part of the program was introduced during my time as chairman and lasted for the first difficult years during the 1990s. I recall that we collected the equivalent of around 700 to 800 euros twice a year, a considerable sum in those days. The implementation of this program led to several trips to Tartu in the following years. We crossed the Baltic Sea on the MS Estonia with suitcases full of donated material. The ombudsman that followed after me kept his project running until well into the 1990s, until things had developed sufficiently and the support program was obsolete. So why did we decide to support our fellow students in Tartu? For us who were involved in this at the Student Union in Stockholm, we saw the opportunity and took it when it came along during a turbulent time in European history. We were convinced that it was the right thing to do. Ideological preferences seemed to matter little in this respect. University students for many is a search for knowledge and a way to try to orientate yourself in a complicated and dynamic world, as it was then and is now. Even though we did not have by any means the full picture of what was going on or understood everything that happened, far from it, we did it anyway. The support project we set up together offered an opportunity to include our student colleagues into the wider community around the Baltic Sea and learn more about the region. The effects were long-term, and changes, as we all know, not instant. It takes time. For us at that time and that place, there was little doubt that we should do this. Our colleagues in Tartu had been less fortunate than us. It put our own work at the Student Union in stark perspective. The freedoms that we had and took for granted, they had just regained. It was obvious to us what should be done. My story doesn't end there though. There is a second part that is still ongoing, and I'll say a few words about this. A few years later, having left university studies and joined the Swedish Defence Research Agency, which is a civilian agency under the Ministry of Defence, one of our tasks was to analyze and give input to Swedish sovereignty support for the independent Baltic states. There were several issues we worked with. Among them was how Estonia's armed forces could develop and how we could contribute to the design of a suitable operational concept for the armed forces. How could such a concept be achieved in order to deter from Russian revanchism? Before joining NATO and the European Union became a distinct possibility, the option of Nordic support was the only one available. The poor economic state set strict limits on what was possible, and the analytical process of choosing what equipment to acquire, personnel systems to develop, and concepts over the longer term was very much the art of the possible. The questions were numerous. How could Estonian sea lanes be monitored? How could the clearing of sea mines and unexploded ordnance be undertaken to support Estonia's international imports and exports? In what way could peace support operations contribute to integrate Estonia to support long-term development of international rules-based order? How could military training and education be organized to support integration into Western security and defense context? After cautious beginnings, this sovereignty support from Sweden developed gradually during the 1990s and culminated with offers of donation of complete brigade sets of one infantry brigade and anti-aircraft battalion to each of the Baltic states, among other things. 25 years later, it's clear that this long-term process was one part of the contributions to modern Estonian armed forces that's well integrated into the Euro-Atlantic community. Estonian membership in NATO from 2004 changed the focus and emphasis and direction of Nordic-Baltic cooperation. Still, Nordic-Baltic cooperation remains important since the Baltic Sea region is increasingly seen as one strategic space. In a worsening strategic climate where the Nordic-Baltic region is again on the line of confrontation, this cooperation has taken on new importance. And we'll hear more about this in the panel on security cooperation that follows. So to end here, since 1990, I've had Estonia and issues of Baltic security as a part of my professional and personal rucksack. The events then and since became part of who I am today. Thank you.
Thank you. My story is somewhat similar to Niklas, and when preparing for today's event, I really was upset with myself, deeply regretting that I am not a person who writes diaries. Because really, you know, when you look back, you don't realize then that you're actually part of history. But now, when trying to prepare for this and finding Kaarel again after not having seen him for like 25 years or something, I realized that it was momentous. And what we did, as you said, we really didn't know what we were getting ourselves into, but that we were part of something this big. Now, my story starts in '89. I was a new student at the Uppsala University, enrolled to study Russian language and what was then called Eastern State Studies. It later changed to Eastern European Studies, but at the time it was called Öststatskunskap, Eastern State Studies. I remember coming to Uppsala, buying all the books, and that was a considerable investment. It was rather expensive. And like 3 weeks later I had to throw everything out the window. And we proceeded actually our first semester at university by listening to radio in the middle of the night and then meeting with our lecturers in the morning to discuss what had happened. Because of course the Berlin Wall fell. Now in 1990 I started to involve myself in student politics. Uppsala University had something that was called the Gustav Fröding stipend. And in 1990, it was awarded by a vote among the students to Astrid Lindgren, who declined the prize and instead gave back the money to be used for 2 Estonian students to come to Uppsala to study for a semester. That was kind of a little bit what started some of the people-to-people contacts that later developed between Estonia and Uppsala students. Uppsala also had contacts with students in Vilnius. And there was one official tour, I wasn't part of this, but one official tour made to Vilnius by a chartered plane. And on the way back, with a minivan, they stopped in Tallinn to meet with Estonian students. And that inspired the continuous and the deepened support that later developed. So the idea came up, why not organize something like you did in Stockholm? Why not organize something more comprehensive in order to support Baltic students? For instance, I know that my colleagues at Student Union invited students from Estonia to come and for study visits to Uppsala, to visit companies and visit university and to stay, you know, a week or so with students, just to get to know each other. And I was elected international secretary of the Uppsala Student Union in 1991. And early that year, just like you did, we received a call, a letter from Tartu Ülikooli Üliõpilaskond, which is, by the way, the first Estonian word I ever learned. It means Tartu Student Union, University Student Union. It was a letter, a call for support, for help, and it came from Kaarel, I think. So we set out for a fact-finding mission. We gathered me and a bunch of students, went to Tarand to see what was going on. Met with Kaarel and his team at the EUS Corporation, and we were shown everything, and then we were greeted, you know, like kings. And we were so taken by the generosity of these students who had absolutely nothing. And we sat down and think, what can we do? Is there anything at all that we can do? One of the things that we decided to do was that we could share expertise, what we thought we had at least, of how to organize yourself as students. How can you organize a student union? How do you organize voting? How do you run meetings? How do you take, you know, in a democratic way, collect money and support students, and how do you build a student organization in a democratic way? And I remember distinctly one such initiative that we took. I was tasked to be the project coordinator then of something that we called the concept of democracy, which was a summer course for Baltic students. We invited all three, but only Lithuanians and Estonians showed up. And the ones who were most engaged in this was the Estonians. We had the condition that you have to come with gender-balanced teams, otherwise you're not welcome. And I remember Kaarel was a little bit concerned, where would he find engaged women? But you managed. You managed to find two, I remember that. And they also went on to actually have good careers afterwards. We organized this course. I remember it so clearly because I really don't remember anything of what we did. Because the whole course was overshadowed by the events in August, because actually we had managed to time it for the middle end of August. So the 19th, 20th and 21st of August, the whole course crashed, collapsed, and instead the student union was turned into some kind of telephone room with you in the middle, making phone calls all over the place in order to try to figure out what was going on in Estonia, what was happening here, and to making sure that people on different sides were kept in the loop and informed. This was a small part of the contribution that we could do. I'm not going to speak a lot about this because I really want to hear Kaarel. I'm just going to say that to be part of this was an extremely humbling experience. And really, this has shaped everything that I did professionally afterwards in my life. I worked with FOI. I worked with the OEC station here for several years in the late 90s. And I really feel that it's like coming full circle now, when I, as the ambassador of the Eastern Partnership here, reflect on, you know, what is it that we're doing? I came here 30 years ago trying to give expertise and advice and support the Estonian colleagues. And today, as an Eastern Partnership ambassador, when I have something that needs to be done, or I see cooperation, or I need advice, the first ones I call are the Estonians. So thank you for letting me be part of this.
Thanks. For me, it started a little bit earlier than 1990. Because, well, if you have some kind of common religion here in Estonia, it's education. And of course, our university must be always in the center of this, the biggest church you have. Of course, it's a Tartu University. So, when I became a student, after doing my military prisoner time in 2 years in the Soviet Army, in '87, there were already a bunch of students active and educated enough to understand that there will be a huge change. It is coming, and it's in the reach already. So it was time already in '87 to start preparations. And what were preparations? Those times we wanted to start over from a moment in June 1940. So forget all this in between and start our society, build up the society with different kind of grassroots institutions, civil society, as it was in 1940, as much as we knew about that. So we started to re-establish the old student organizations. It was the first step. In 88, we managed to do that. There was, of course, from the official side, a different kind of opposition to that, but we even succeeded in making it legal in the Soviet terms. So, and of course, the next step was then we had already these old societies which had continued to exist and in the exile in Sweden, the States, Canada, and so on. So the old, we re-established the contacts, of course, with those and got some knowledge how to run this kind of democratic organizations, the student societies and so on. So the next step, in 89, we tried hard already to establish the overall student union. We wanted to have our university back, because it was a Soviet institution where you were treated as a student as a second-level citizen, so to be brainwashed and trained like a sort of technician only. We wanted it to be, again, an enlightenment institution. So the next step, as we understood, following what the life looked like in Finland, in Sweden, and so on, that the student unions, the student bodies, or student bodies, is a must in the university to gain some power in the academic decision-making, which was not the case in the Soviet university, of course. The student had no right to speak there or be part of the decision-making. So, but the first we tried in 89, but we had not enough support from among the students. Most of the students were sort of Soviet students those times, because we were afraid, we didn't want to mess with politics, but there was enough of activists that we managed to re-establish the student union in the end of 1990. And so, of course, the first thing to do was to find friends. Everybody needed to find friends abroad. And so that's a moment where we started writing the letters. The most complicated thing was to find the right addresses. We had no address books of Sweden or Stockholm or Uppsala, but step by step we found out how to contact, and it was a telefax. In the University of Tartu we had really 2 direct lines and numbers to the Western world. So one of that was the university fax machine, which was the holy place, a sacred place where in the university where all the professors came and humbly asked that would you send a fax to Oxford or somewhere or Uppsala and so on. So we had good connections to that office and could send our own faxes. First of them maybe was really that please help us, but the next was for sure the invitation, come here and look who we are and let's make it to be friends. Of course, we tried desperately to look like Western people, to talk like Western people. We had no money and no beautiful clothes on us, but we tried so hard to prove that we are not no Soviets. I hope we managed to do this. So, but it was very important, and the second thing was, of course, our orientation and wish was that we would become a Nordic country, a Nordic society. Those times it was actual, and in the 90s we preferred on the government level. It doesn't seem like so important thing to do, to connect with the Nordic countries and behave like a Nordic country. We have better allies now. The big one, with whom we go to wars and so on. So, but yes, what followed was that they came and we had a lot of parties and we discussed politics, of course, and I believe already those times Anna and Niklas learned that not all the people in the country, especially the youth, the students, are satisfied with the developments of the country, Estonia as well. For us, the students, it was always, even though we had these new prominent leaders and accepted in the society, but they were middle-aged already. And they did too little, too late all the time. So we had to push this forward, and we wanted to be radicals. And not only on the state level, but the university politics, it was the same. As I can say that, we were lucky in Tartu that in 1988, the old communist rector of the university passed away, and we got a new one, Jüri Luik, who was really an academic person, and had his one semester in Toronto. So he knew how Western Free University looks like and what has to be done. But he had a bunch of old, whom we later started to call red professors. There was a lot of them, stagnated ones in the university, and so the only ally the rector had in the university, it was the students. And he asked us to make radical demands, and then he could manage to do his moderate reforms. Because, well, the students asked it, and of course the strongest argument was that we had to know how it is done in the West, in the free world, and if we came out and said to the university, well, you know, in Stockholm or in Uppsala, they do it this way, and we have these rights and so on, and so I thought, okay, and then, of course, we must do it then, if the West does it. So that was the situation then. And unfortunately, I don't know how the cooperation between student unions has developed during the, let's say, last 10-15 years, but it's not so visible, I believe. I should have noticed if there was something going on. So, thanks.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I think that was a wonderful experience to listen to you, and to the point of being touching, really, to hear you sort of reconnecting after 25-30 years and sort of sharing the same history from two sides. We will open up for questions. Well, I would ask one to begin with. I am active in a Swedish sports association. And without, comparison, the situation you were in was, of course, much different from what is the case in the Swedish Sports Federation of today. However, what is happening is the erosion of grassroots democracy. People today do not know how democracy is being conducted at the factory level. At the grassroots level. I'm speaking about sports clubs, sports federations, and I would imagine even in other areas of society, because we are not used to that. When I was young, this was part of your upbringing. You participated, you learned how the work was done. And I can only imagine the scale of the challenge that you had in establishing this sort of grassroots democracy. And I would like to hear a little bit how you actually did it. You alluded to it, Anna, a little bit. How did you work with actually establishing the democratic habits at the grassroots level? Because that obviously didn't exist when you came into the picture. So if you would have any comments on that, I would, and maybe we can also learn something in our reality today.
I can start by saying a few words, and I think you're absolutely right, Michael. It's possibly that we're taking all these rights and freedoms for granted. So they don't need to be maintained or refurbished now and then, as they always have to. And that is, of course, a risk. It may slip into something which is, indifference can be the death of democracy. So that risk is clearly there. In those days, I think what struck us is that it put your own engagement in what you actually did in perspective. We had something that we did take for granted then that you had just regained, as I think I said. And that was very important, because what does it actually mean to be a student union politician or an official. And this is something you could take further into your professional work and your life after that. So I think that mattered a lot, and I said as much as that it's part of my rucksack today, and I think this experience, 90, 91, 92, that was extremely important to me. And I just hope that under different circumstances that others are able to have the same experience, not the same circumstances, but still, it's an education.
Yeah, well, the first honest answer is how did we do it? I honestly don't know. I really don't remember all those details. You know, you're young, you're a little bit crazy, you don't really know that things cannot be done, and then that's why you just do them. And you improvise as you go along. And I think that one of the important components here is that there are institutions out there that are receptive to the young people's crazy ideas. Because young people will not come with the idea presented according to the format in the project formula that is required by the institution that gives the grant. The young people will come with the idea, this is the way we want to do it. And actually the institution will have to design, redesign and adjust its tools in order to be able to catch what the young people want to do. And
it's just a framework.
It's just a framework. And I think that one of the things that we learned, I think, is that the university was very receptive to us. There were companies or there were universities that found ways of giving us a little bit of seed money when we needed it. It wasn't much, and we didn't need much, but they were receptive to the things that we asked for. Which, and I don't know if I'm out of line here, I'm not sure our institutions today are. I think maybe our systems are so rigid today that we cannot catch, but I might be out of bounds here. When you put the price on everything, you know the value of nothing.
Yeah.
And here we had no price on anything. But we intrinsically felt the value of everything that we did, regardless of how we did it. And Kaarel is the one who can tell us what we did and how we did it, because I don't remember. I just know that we improvised as we went along.
So what I can say is that we were quite good in rules, to reestablish the rules, write down the charters and election rules and of the student bodies and so on. But what we didn't know at all was how to run on a daily basis, how to run the business, how to organize things, and of course we got very good experiences there. We understood how this is done, but we had one minor thing, that we had no money for it. They had their fees and so on. It was the hardest thing to do to prove the students that you must start paying a fee for being a compulsory member of a student union, because all these compulsory things were not very much liked during those times. We had a period of compulsory things, and so compulsory union, trade union, student trade union we had in the Soviet time, and all these ideological organizations, and so nobody wanted to pay a fee. Of course, we had this ruble, no money, and so I don't know how we ran this business for the first 2-3 years before we got thanks. We got some support, some aid, financial aid, and of course all these loads of textbooks and so on. But yes, the daily business was complicated because we wanted to do the same thing, but without any money. That was the case.
Thank you. I'll just ask one more question. I made an assumption when we started this conversation that this all happened outside the realm of government. And this is probably a question because that was sort of the point, I think, on the Estonian side, that it wasn't within the realm of government. But I was wondering on the Swedish side, was this all on a voluntary basis? Did you get any contributions from Swedish authorities in kind or in money? Nothing whatsoever.
I don't think they knew about us.
Yeah. I mean, this is during the years when this fine embassy was open. We had absolutely zero contact with official Sweden, nothing at all. And there was some benign support, mostly verbally, from some university professors who sort of liked the idea more or less and said, student activity generally is good. We don't know exactly what they're doing, but it's probably good. So that's a positive support that we got, but nothing financial.
But maybe we were wrong. Maybe you did know about us.
we don't know.
Well, at least the Soviets knew what we were doing. Because at least until the end of 89, I believe, or in 1990, you had to first get the right to go out. The first visa was from the KGB. And then you had only the right to go to the foreign embassy to ask for visa. So we're properly checked before anything happened, before we could go there. At least maybe in 91 it was not the case anymore, but I can't recall exactly where it stopped and when.
Well, that was actually my next question, because I guess at some point you had to go under the radar, of course, with what you were doing, and I guess that was the point also of cooperation. I would invite anyone who would like to ask a question to do so. Are there questions to the panelists? Yes, please.
Not so much of a question, more of a
We'll
comment.
give you a microphone here. So.
There will be a microphone.
Thank you. I'm Marianne Kellum, have been Marianne Ricken in the past, and I've been fighting for freedom and democracy all my life, I think. But the reason I wanted to comment here was thinking about Kaarel and his efforts with no money to organize something big. Estonians seem to have a penchant for doing this and succeeding. If you think about the Citizens Committee, registering, nearly 900,000 people as citizens of free Estonia, right when they have Soviet passports in their pockets. Incredible operation, which then led to the Congress of Estonia, which of course by then there was some support from other citizens groups in Estonia, but it was not something supported by the official Soviet administration. So it can be done, and it's a sad thing that in this modern world we seem to be losing this ability to come together and do something with no money. And get started, and then perhaps somebody will finance you. I know the historian Neil Ferguson points this out, how de Tocqueville wrote about America, about all of these voluntary organizations. Yeah. Everyone is doing things, getting together, men's clubs, building hospitals, concert halls, whatever. And he said there is an incredibly depressing decrease in participation in these voluntary organizations. Let government do it. And that's very sad and very ominous. But thank you for my comment, but you can comment on my comment.
Yes, what I should say about that, why we were so successful in the late 80s in our building up civil society and institutions and all these political organizations that you mentioned, is what that we had a lot of time, paid time, in jobs where we did nothing. we didn't work for the Soviets anymore, but we got paid there. We had these jobs, and we had a lot of free time to do anything we want to kill the Soviet Union. Nowadays we go to the jobs and have a lot of work to do. So we can't use this time anymore.
Lars, Fredén, please.
I joined Uppsala University in 1971, and I remember that there was it was compulsory to be a member of it. And there was, you had to pay, and then there were a paper where you could check boxes for various things, and it was full of so-called liberation organizations in Africa. And so things changed. My question is, this is much later, but was your interest in Estonia welcomed by all of your members? Was it not considered arch conservative, and shouldn't you have done other things with your time?
No.
Yeah, stop.
No, but it was my recollection is that it was totally welcome. You know, when the Berlin Wall fell down, everything changed, and it really engaged young people. So even it wasn't that those who had been engaged in Nicaragua or in Africa groups that they changed that, but they added the Baltics to it, because it was part of the same liberation in ideologically in that mind. So no, it wasn't seen as a partisan thing. I represented a non-party student party in Uppsala, but both my student colleagues to the left and to the right, we were all united in that this was the right thing to do.
Yeah. I think it was similar in Stockholm as well. I mean, we had a coalition who ran the student union at the time, and it was similar parties to what Anna's party was, sort of non-ideological, student-oriented, and some people on the left and some people on the right. But Tartu didn't really matter, because all these voluntary contributions that you could make, there were some who students on the left could support, others who were sort of liberal or to the right, and others humanitarian ones. And the whole idea why this was set up was because during the, at least in Stockholm, during the Vietnam War, there were petitions to sell all the assets that the student union had, so they could buy anti-aircraft guns for the Vietnamese liberation army. So this was
which was stopped.
Sorry?
Which was stopped.
Which was stopped, but I mean this was seen as a better solution. So that's the arrangement that we arrived at, and it stood us in good stead in 1991.
I should also add, of course, that in terms of Uppsala, having a relationship with Tartu University was obvious, since it is the second university of Sweden. So it was really, a kinship already there.
Right.
Yeah, that's what we told you. We are also a Swedish university. You have your duties.
Stockholm was different, much more modern, of course. But you did have one important part, and that's also, I don't know where that came about, the statue of Gustavus Adolphus. That was an issue I remember at the time.
Yeah, we wanted to bring it back.
Yes,
yeah.
And it was brought back.
Yeah, but before that, I believe in spring '88, we built up one of snow, yes, for 3 days there, to give a signal to the university that it's time.
It's time, yeah.
Thank you all very much, and I'm happy to say that we keep that tradition alive. We go to the Gustavus Adolphus statue every year. We put flowers together with the rector of the university. And actually next week I will be in Tartu with several colleagues to open an exhibition, a permanent exhibition at the university museum that will actually show the history of Tartu University from the Swedish times through the Russian and Soviet times and as a national university of Estonia. So that is actually on the 29th of November. If someone is in Tartu, you will be most welcome to join us for that inauguration. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I think this was a fantastic illustration of one piece of the puzzle, and exactly as we had wanted it to be, a case study. And I do have a few gifts for you. To say thank you very much for your contributions. Kaarel, thank you so much. And sorry about this. Anna and Niklas, it was so good of you to come. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.